Well, welcome everyone to this special session, special double session on digital 3D stereoscopic entertainment. Chris Ward and I spent many emails and Skype sessions trying to work out what we were going to do with this session and promoting it and planning it, and I think you'll agree that it's come together really well. Our first speaker in the session is Rob Engle from Sony Pictures Imageworks. He's been at Sony for 11 years now and is their stereographer and digital effects supervisor. Over his years at Sony, he's worked on many very well-known 3D movies such as The Polar Express, Monster House, and also Open Season, and of course Beowulf, which you'll be talking about today. So, Rob, over to you. Uh-oh.
It's all right. I got the mic. That's all that I need. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for all for coming. I wanted to first of all address the title that I have here. It was one of the questions I always get is, well, what does that all mean? And basically, I like to joke that I wanted to get the longest title that I could in the screen credits for Beowulf, and so I asked to get this really long credit. But actually, it really divides into two aspects of my job. One is the stereographer part, which is basically all the creative aspects associated with setting depth and the use of 3D in the 3D version of Beowulf. And then secondly, the 3D digital effects supervisor part is really the part of my job that involves taking the work of the artists and approving it and taking it all the way to delivery of the film. So there's sort of two parts of it. One is the creative part of how deep is the 3D and how do we do the 3D, and the other part is just the mechanics of finishing the movie. It's really great that at this event, which I was expecting was going to be nothing but very technical talks, that I've met a lot of great people who are responsible for creating content in 3D as well. So this has really been a nice opportunity for me to meet some of the content creators and also have a chance to talk to the people that are making the technology possible. So thank you for having me. As required with every talk, of course, the overview of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Beowulf project was, how we got started on it, what I think the challenges of the project were, and how we addressed them. Since this is displays and applications, talking a little bit about the types of reviewing systems that we used in our day-to-day work. And then talk a little bit about the tools that we used for creating cameras and end up with a few examples. The projects that I worked on in the past, I started off on the Polar Express 3D, which was an IMAX release in 2004, and it's been released numerous years since then. The key there is that was, I think for a lot of people in Hollywood, it was sort of a wake-up call that you could take these CG features for very little incremental cost, turn them into stereoscopic films, and cross your fingers, hopefully make some money off of it. And after that, there was sort of the digital renaissance with the Real D release of Chicken Little, which showed people that it could be done in multiplex theaters. So we followed that up with Monster House, which was a Real D release. It was released on, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 theaters, and again, showed that you could, for very little incremental cost, you could make a 3D movie. And then our third project was Open Season, which was released in IMAX theaters. So a little over a year ago, in November of 2006, I was approached to work on Beowulf. And Beowulf was a rather high-profile project for us because not only was it Robert Zemeckis who'd worked with us as director on Polar Express, but he was also the producer on Monster House. But it was very clear very early on this was going to be released in a lot of theaters. That one of the things that's been happening, of course, as we get more and more 3D theaters, these releases become more high-profile. Additionally, it was the first film that was going to be released in multiple formats. At the time that it was announced, we knew that it was going to be in Real D theaters, and they'd said they were going to have somewhere near 1,000 screens. The deal with IMAX was very close, so it was pretty certain that IMAX was going to happen. And very late in the game, the Dolby 3D system came along. And one of the unique properties of this film is that, in contrast to so many of the other projects, the look of the film was intended to be a stylized but nearly photoreal look, and so I think that puts an extra level of or an extra requirement on us to make the 3D experience as convincing as possible. We couldn't get away with it not being, not feeling like you're really seeing these people in a real 3D world because they look so real. If you look at Open Season or some other movie where it's obviously a fake world you're looking at, you could probably cheat things a little bit more. So I want to talk about the challenges that we encountered on this project, and the first was that, as you folks know, if you go into a multiplex theater, you really don't know what size theater you're going to get, what size screen you're going to get, what the geometry of the room is going to be like. We did a brief survey of theaters, and I found theaters that were really wide and shallow, and other ones that were really long and narrow, and other ones that were sort of box-like. And then, of course, the screen sizes varied widely, too, anywhere from 30 to 80 feet. 80 feet being the sort of the IMAX typical screen size. So the key there is that we were creating content where we really didn't know where people were going to be seated or what kind of, we didn't have a theater that's like, oh, this is going to be seen in this particular layout. And so we had to really think about how we created our depth choices so that even people in the front row could experience the movie and enjoy it, but not feel like the people in the back row didn't get their money's worth. One of the other challenges was that the time period of this film, the time period the film takes place in, was one in which there wasn't electric light. There wasn't, most of the scenes take place indoors or at night. And the result is that most of the film, at least 60% of the film, takes place in a very contrasty environment, where the character may be lit up with a bright edge, but the background's very dark, or there's torches all over the place. And the result of that look was that we had to deal with ghosting. We had to really be aware of what problems ghosting would introduce. One of the chief complaints that people have when they look at 3D material is ghosting. And it takes people out of the movie, and it takes people out of the 3D experience if ghosting is too apparent. One other thing that we wanted to be very careful of was what I call the cardboard effect, and I'm sure you all know what that means. It's basically this feeling that instead of looking at truly dimensional creatures in your 3D world, they feel like they're just cards. And going back to what I said about the film having a photoreal look to it, it was important to me that it felt like you were there with the characters and that they feel fully dimensional. One other problem, particularly in multiplex theaters, is that you're very aware of the edges of the screen. There's this problem where any object that intersects the edge of the screen that is actually in front of the edge of the screen creates this sort of paradox where you can see stuff you really shouldn't be able to see because the screen would actually be closer to you. And so we had to solve or address that problem as well. And then the last the last challenge on this film was that it really wasn't quote-unquote designed for 3D. And what I mean by that is that it wasn't like when they were setting up the film that we were looking at it in 3D and making lens choices for 3D. The way that the film was conceived was as a 2D film that was being adapted for 3D. And so it was my team's responsibility to take the 3D work and make the changes that were necessary, to take the 2D work that was being created in a 3D world and adapt it for 3D. So how did we address those challenges? I'll go through this fairly quickly. The first was that we composed everything for IMAX, meaning that for the most part, things were done with parallel cameras, zero parallax corresponded to very far away objects. And then what we would do is at the time of delivery, we would put a divergence on the frames that would, for real D, for the digital 3D delivery, it would push everything back into the screen. I don't know if people know this or not, but for IMAX theaters, what they do is they actually put some divergence on the projection lenses, which pushes everything back. But that doesn't happen in a digital 3D theater, so we have to do that in the content. As far as ghosting goes, there's really very little you can do about it except being very aware of it, making sure that you put things at the screen plane that are going to ghost a lot, or try and reduce contrast. I talk about that a fair amount in the paper. We used multiple cameras, which was a technique that the people at Disney used on Meet the Robinsons to great effect. We used that a lot, and I'll show you examples of that. We used the floating window, which was a technique that I think the Spottiswoode brothers came up with to solve the problems with the screen surround, basically pushing the edge of the screen towards the audience. And because this movie wasn't designed for 3D, we would go in and make changes as needed. We'd recompose shots, we'd change the focal length, and so on to fix those problems. Real quick review of how we reviewed our work. Artists at their workstations had anaglyph glasses, and of course they had tools where they could toggle between the left and right eyes. We had a number of walk-up workstations spread throughout the facility where the artists could look at their work in full-color 3D, typically CRT-based systems, but we also had a DLP-based rear projection monitor that we could see slightly larger imagery, 60 inches. And then for our final reviews, we had two systems. One was a dual projector system that was with fixed polarizers, and then our big room, which was about a 12-foot screen, we had a RealD system that was generously provided by the RealD folks. Real quickly going through how we created our cameras, we had a live, one of the things we did was we contracted with the Autodesk folks to provide for live stereo capability in Maya, meaning that you can use OpenGL drawing primitives in 3D and actually get a 3D output from Maya. That, I believe, is available in the latest releases of Maya. Additionally, we created a specialized viewer that would allow us to view the multiple camera rigs in true 3D, so we could place individual characters in 3D space using those multiple camera rigs. We had a system that would allow us to view our shots in the context of the edit. And what that would do is that would allow us to tune the depth on a per-shot basis. We could look at how cuts would transition and tune that all live within Maya. We also had what I call near real-time playback of scenes. What that means is that even though we had very complex animation, we had some OpenGL streaming software which would let us basically scrub through the scenes and see how they would actually play, how the animation would actually play. All of this is important to trying to get a real feel for how the 3D experience is going to play out in a real theater. So it's time for some examples. This is my test subject. We tested all of the Beowulf material on my 18-month-old daughter. The examples that I'm going to show there's basically 5 of them, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. We'll go ahead and do the first one, please, Bob. I don't know if can we turn these off, the overheads? Okay. What this is just a test of changing the interaxial spacing of the lenses. And what's most important here to note, there's 2 things to note. One is that as the interaxial gets large, you start to see ghosting, particularly on the right-hand side of the character's face. And that was one of the problems we wanted to stay away from. This is a typical environment on the film. Additionally, though, as the interaxial spacing gets large, you also see that the internal depth, the nose and the eyes really start to come out, and you really start to get a sense for the shape of the character. We wanted to keep the shape of the character but not have the ghosting. So let's go to the next example. The next example is one in which we're effectively using a very simple example of a multiple camera rig. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm fixing the interaxial spacing in the background and you know, leaving that alone, but then varying the interaxial spacing for the character himself, leaving him, using convergence to leave him mostly at the screen plane. And so hopefully what you're seeing here is that there's very little to no ghosting, but we're able to control his apparent roundness. And that, of course, is very important to making this a believable or realistic experience. Let's go to the next example. The next example is showing how this might be used in the context of a multiple character shot. This was probably one of the more complex shots we had in the film. We had 5 different characters plus the background, and we used 5 different cameras for this. So in this example, all I'm doing here is adjusting the interaxial spacing of the main character, Beowulf, who's in the middle there. And you can see that things start to break down when you go too far. He might work here a little bit, but now we're starting to get into a problem area where his hand actually is behind the horse, and he starts to look a little weird. So this gives you an idea of the kind of control that we have, but it also gives you an idea of the kinds of problems that you can introduce if you're not careful with this technique. And the next example shows that to an even greater extent, I think. So this is now, we're fixing the interocular, or the interaxial spacing, but here we're just adjusting convergence. And you can see that he starts to look gigantic if we place him at the wrong depth. You know, something like this might work well, but as we get back here, it just clearly doesn't work. It's a different movie. And yes, thank you. And so the last example is one in which I wanted to demonstrate how focal length affects our perception. This is a fixed interaxial, but all I'm doing is adjusting the focal length of the lens and the position. This is a wide-angle lens, and here's a narrow lens, and you can see that she's kind of flat here, but if you turn the knob too far, then things start to really go a little out of control. So again, here's another tool that we used, and we used it actually a fair amount on the film, where we would, in particular in cases where you could see the character interacting with the background, in this case she's actually in the water, rather than adjusting interaxial to the point where things broke, maybe we adjust the focal length. Anyway, that's it for my prepared material. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so do I have time? I have 3 minutes. So please state your name and affiliation and ask away if there are any questions.
Any questions from the audience? Down the front here.
My question is, you mentioned that you would edit in sort of the context of the film, okay? And I was just wondering, sometimes when I've seen a lot of 3Ds, my eyes get tired of hard cuts where basically something's in front of the screen and all of a sudden the next cut is back and back. Can you comment on exactly how you handled that and whether or not you watched for that in particular?
One of the interesting things about this film was that the edit was done really without 3D in mind, and so we just had to adapt to that. What typically we would do is we would look at the cut, and if it was a shot or a sequence where maybe it was just back and forth between 2 characters, it was relatively trivial to just say, hey, let's make sure that where people are usually looking, which is people's eyes, that those are at the same depth, or very close to the same depth. The harder situation was wide shot, narrow shot, wide shot, narrow shot. And in those situations, depending on how hard we thought the transition was going to be on the eyes, we might actually cheat things, like maybe the wide shot, if we were just looking at it in isolation, we might have pushed the character back into the screen, but given that it was back and forth, we might actually bring the whole wide shot out of the screen to bring it closer to the close-up of the character. So in other words, we would tune it on a per-shot basis.
Any other questions? Lewis?
Which software did you use to edit? You stayed in Maya, or you used another stereoscopic software, I would say.
The editing itself of the film, meaning bringing the shots together, was done in Avid Film Composer. What we have is we have a set of tools that takes that edit, brings those into Maya, and allows us to take the actual animation from each of those shots in context, and then we dial the parameters for the 3D cameras on a per shot basis, and all those parameters are animatable. And then
Rob Calvis.
At the beginning, you mentioned about the different films, screen sizes. Pardon me. What about the aspect ratio difference between the theatrical presentations and IMAX?
In the case of this film, and in fact, I think all of the films we've done so far, the released versions, all of the 3D released versions matched the 2D version of the film. So this was actually released 235 in IMAX theaters. There was a large amount of band, and I have a very funny anecdote about how many pounds of black were in the film. Way back there.
One more question, down the back.
I'll talk loud. So, you know, I'm surprised that it wasn't designed for 3D, because there were all these classic 3D effects like the rotating camera and things poking at the screen, birds, you know, worm's eye view on the beach. And you know, it was done excellently. But the main problem I saw was the judder. So you're stuck at 24 frames a second. And I noticed that the judder problem that, you know, you can ignore a lot of movies just really jumped out in 3D, and they made the multiple edge ghosting more complicated. Did you have a chance to think about that at all?
Well, you know, it's interesting because we had a project, I don't know if everybody heard the question, but it was basically, did we have a chance to look at judder and how it affected the resulting image? We did a project, Monster House, where the intentional look of the film was to make it look like stop motion. And so in that film, there was actually no motion blur at all. And in my mind, that was the place where it became very apparent that you absolutely have to have motion blur. And I think that the place where I saw the problem mostly in Beowulf was in quick camera pans, or if the character was running across the screen. My feeling was I really didn't think it was that big a problem, that it was something I was going to worry about. There were some interesting technology problems that I've seen, particularly in frame sequential systems. I've noticed that characters that are moving rapidly from one side of the screen to another will actually appear at a different depth, and that is problematic, and I wish we could have done something to solve that, but unfortunately we couldn't fix it for one release without breaking it for another, and so we just ended up kind of leaving that alone. There's some really beautiful shots in it. I wouldn't say were ruined, but were compromised by that effect.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Rob for his presentation.
Thank you.
Rob is hanging around the conference, so I'm sure you might be mobbed afterwards for some more questions.